All right, we are going to move on to the Lewis and Clark expedition on chapter 3. So, this is called Death on the Missouri. Bear! In the lengthening shadows of the afternoon, with the boats tied up along the river bank, Clark and Juilliard were hunting. Suddenly, they saw a bear's familiar hump in a swaying thicket of honeysuckle. Bear steaks and rump stews were welcome in the camp kettles, and the fur would keep someone warm in the bleak winter ahead. Clark fired his gun first, but this bear did not drop. It reared with a roar of the underbrush and rushed at its tormentors. Juilliard fired, yet still the bear did not fall. Clark was looking down the red mouth full of dripping fangs when he pumped a third ball into the beast. This was more than the explorers had bargained for. The roly-poly bears of New England rarely required even a second shot. Clark took refuge behind a tree, and Juilliard discharged still a fourth pellet into the snarling target. Clark had been given a few precious seconds in which to reload, and for a fifth time the animal was hit. But now their shot and powder had been scattered across the ground in the melee. Two frightened men dropped their guns and leaped from a high bank into the Missouri. They swam to a sandbar and crawled out limp and dripping. Juilliard peered nervously over his shoulder. "Captain, look!" And no wonder at his excitement. The bear, with 5 piercing balls in its carcass, was swimming after them. Clark and Juilliard drew their hunting knives and huddled on the far edge of the sandbar. They would battle to the end against such a bear as white men probably had never seen before. The bear plodded out of the water and onto the beach, its head weaving from side to side like a pendulum. Then, slowly, it toppled over. Shaken and trembling, the true frontiersmen at last examined their kill. "It'd make 3 of the bears I used to hunt in Ohio," said the astonished Clark. The bear's fur was a grizzled reddish brown. Its claws were like pitchforks. The bear weighed between 500 and 600 pounds and measured 8 feet 7.5 inches from nose to hind feet. This pelt would keep more than one man warm. Americans had discovered the grizzly bear, Ursus horribilis, the frightful bear, Captain Lewis called the discovery. And now the men murmured around the bubbling teapot about shaggy elephants and flaming dragons. What couldn't turn up in this vast and endless realm, where there were bears the size of a coach and 4? We take for granted today the wild creatures in which roam our continent, but to Lewis and Clark they were as strange as some of the weird fish from the very bottom of the ocean are to us now. Antelope, prairie dogs, mountain goats, bighorn sheep, grizzlies, silver fox, marten, white cranes, and many species of duck and geese. All these were unknown until Lewis and Clark went west. The captains scribbled constantly in their notebooks what a tale they would have to tell when they returned. They made crude sketches of fleeting antelope and a snarling grizzly bear. Ordway added drawings to his account papers. We must remember that these men had no cameras, not even an old-fashioned Kodak with bellows and cloth hood. Clark cut out the heart of the great grizzly lying dead on the sandbar, "as big as the heart of a full-grown ox," he said, and called on others to witness this astounding fact. They signed their names at the bottom of the page in his diary, where he told how the bear had swum the river after being hit 5 times by rifle balls. That page and the pelt of the grizzly would be their only proof if ever they stood in the presence of Mr. Jefferson at the White House and related the afternoon's amazing happenings. But even St. Louis seemed far off to Private John Newman, who stared in fright back down the twisting Missouri. What awaited them in this lonely land? Newman disobeyed an order to stand guard at night, and instantly a court-martial was called in the wilderness. Only privates sat in judgment on their fellow soldier. "Have you reached a verdict?" asked Clark. 75 lashes, answered Private Werner. While a wandering tribe of peaceful Arikara Indians watched in horror, Newman more than twice ran between two long lines of waiting soldiers. They flailed at his bare and bleeding back with willow switches as he passed. With Drouillard interpreting, the chief of the Arikaras asked the reason for this grind punishment. "We are sent by the Great White Father to make friends with you," Lewis replied. "We are strangers in a far land. If we do not stand by each other, all our lives will be in danger. Even our country may be in peril. He who defies a command must pay the price, for he has endangered his comrades. But this judgment is rendered only by his equals." The old chief listened gravely as Drouillard explained what Lewis had said. As Ordway looked at Newman, slumped at the seat of one of the rowboats, he wondered if it was true that bad luck came in pairs. He did not have long to wait. Charles Floyd, one of the 3 Army sergeants on the expedition, complained of a gnawing pain in his stomach. He lay in the cabin of the keelboat and writhed in agony. At the order of President Jefferson, Lewis had visited the great Philadelphia surgeon, Benjamin Rush, before the westward journey began. Dr. Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, had instructed him carefully in first aid and ministering to the sick. He had also given Lewis a great quantity of pills and powders. "Alas! If only Dr. Rush were here to instruct me now!" bewailed Lewis as he bent over the stricken Floyd. The condition of the sergeant became worse at dawn. After a night of suffering, his pain increased. Tonics and potions only added to his misery. He clutched at the captain's hand to keep from screaming. Then his strength seemed to fade. "I'm going away," he whispered hoarsely. Lewis felt the cold pulse, and his lean face became mask-like. "We will bury the sergeant on the high bluff across the river," he said. The Sioux City, Iowa, now hums and thrives near the grave of this first of all American soldiers to die in the western half of the continent. But on that day that Charles Floyd was buried, his 32 comrades stood silent and alone in an alien land. Even Lewis's big Newfoundland dog, Scannon, sorrowfully eyed the cross of cedar before they all filed off the rocky bluff. Lewis wrote in his diary that Floyd had died of the colic, but we think now that it was probably appendicitis, with a burst appendix pouring infection into the sergeant's body. This episode serves to show us how poorly the expedition was prepared for the perils of the hostile region. It had no doctors, few drugs, no surgical supplies, and no way of ever sending for these things in an emergency. Lewis had divided the party into 3 separate squads so some order could continue even if they were disorganized by an attack. This meant a 3rd sergeant was needed to replace Floyd. The captain called Sergeants John Ordway and Nat Pryor from the circle at the campfire. "I have the power under Army regulations to appoint the new sergeant," he said. "I think it would be better for the spirit of men after this tragedy to have it done by a free election." With neither Lewis nor Clark taking part, the soldiers nominated Privates Gass, Gibson, and Bratton. Ringing speeches were made in the night. The men pretended they were at conventions of the Confederalist or Democratic political parties. Ordway and Pryor distributed pieces of blank paper and passed around a quill pen. When the tallying was finished, Patrick Gass had been elevated to the rank of sergeant in the United States Army, and his pay increased from $5 to $8 a month. For the first time, Americans had voted in the vast domain that they would one day rule by ballot. And we will pick up on chapter 4 later. Thank you.